So ever since my first Armored Core video, I've had a ton of people in the comments telling me that Armored Core 3 is the best of the early generations, and some even saying that it was the peak of the entire franchise. I tried to manage my expectations going in, but it was hard to, knowing that I was going into what seemed to be the majority favorite of the series, immediately after suffering through all 100 missions of Another Age. So, is Armored Core 3 the best game in the series so far? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 6th in a series of videos where I'm playing the Armored Core series for the first time and reviewing every game as I go in preparation for Armored Core 6, which, as of upload, is less than a week away, so I'm pretty on schedule. While it's not necessary to have seen the rest of the videos, you'll be missing a lot of context regarding my personal journey with the franchise if you haven't, so I'll have the playlist linked in the description below if you want to go and watch those first. But with all that out of the way, Armored Core 3 is a third-person mech shooter developed by FromSoftware and released in 2002 for the PlayStation 2. Being the third numbered entry in the franchise also means that this is the first in the third generation of Armored Core. And along with this new generation, FromSoftware decided to reboot the storyline of the Armored Core games. So we're gonna have to talk about the story in this game a little more than usual because of it. Armored Core 3 depicts a world where humanity has begun to live underground after a catastrophic nuclear war that left the surface uninhabitable. Sound familiar yet? This underground society comes to be known as Layered. Layered is ruled by an artificial intelligence known as the Controller, which essentially controls everything that happens in this society. And aside from that, it's the typical Armored Core story with multiple corporations fighting one another for power in order to have more influence over society. You've heard it before. There's some extra intrigue thrown in with the corporations, with some of them being more closely allied to the Controller than others, but that part of the story discussion is a little beyond the scope of this video. But here's where the real intrigue comes in. Early on in the game, company representatives start to realize that the Controller seems to be attacking those that it is normally very closely allied with, and they start to question whether or not the Controller might be malfunctioning, and asking if anything could even really be done if it was. It sets up really interesting questions for the story to answer. The idea that all of humanity is being ruled by an AI and the implication of that AI malfunctioning and lashing out is a really interesting one. But with the basics of the story covered, I started up the game and got into the first mission, and I was actually surprised by just how much Armored Core 3 felt like the Gen 2 games. The jump from Gen 1 to Gen 2 was so significant that when I started up the first Gen 3 game and it felt similar to the last ones, it actually really surprised me. But with this generation, FromSoftware didn't aim to overhaul the entire game the way they did in Gen 2. Rather, they made a multitude of small improvements to the core gameplay and just polished up a lot of the smaller issues with Gen 2. And of course, I have to bring it up again and beat the dead horse. Did they move to dual analog controls for the third generation? Of course not. I don't even have much to say about it at this point, because by now, all of the possible reasons that I had thought of for them not having moved over with the Gen 2 games are null, meaning that FromSoftware just genuinely thought this was the best control scheme they could go with, and the one they wanted to stick with. And look, at this point, I've played like 50 hours of games on this control scheme. I'm more than used to it, but I would be lying if I said that I'm not looking forward to being able to play some of these games on a more modern dual analog control setup. Another thing that I noticed right away is that the art style looks a lot blockier than Gen 2. The PS1 trilogy had this very blocky, bulky, almost Lego-like look to it, which was pretty much done away with in Gen 2 in favor of a much smoother and more futuristic style. But honestly, I'm really glad to see that Armored Core 3 has taken the style back more to something like the PS1 games, because even though I can't really describe why, I think that these ACs look so much more visually interesting than those seen in Armored Core 2 and Another Age. Unfortunately, the visual improvements were not carried across to the menu UI of Armored Core 3, as to me, this feels like a fairly substantial downgrade from Armored Core 2's. I could sit here and go into specifics for like 10 minutes, but essentially it just comes down to things feeling less smooth and convenient here than in the last few games. That, on top of the fact that they moved things around, like making the shop into a sub-menu of the garage and removing the sell menu entirely in favor of making it into a button in the assemble parts menu, it just felt really weird to get used to for me, and even now that I am used to it, I think I still prefer the UIs of both the Gen 1 and 2 games. But smaller things aside, let's get back to some missions. Something that I was actually very surprised by was when I went to find a mission for the first time and was greeted by a map screen. This was probably the last thing I would have expected to carry over from Another Age, and while it's not anywhere near as large as the map in that game, it's still there, meaning that FromSoft still liked the idea and it might grow again in some later entries. And honestly, I'm not upset that it's here either. I don't think it really makes much of a meaningful difference from just having a list of missions, but it does add a little bit of personality, so if this is something that they keep going forward, I'm not exactly going to complain about it. And the mission variety, compared to just having played Another Age, felt great. There were some reused maps still, which is interesting considering that there are only about 40 missions in this game, but it never felt as repetitive as Another Age did by any means. On top of that, there's a new system with missions called the Consort system. For certain missions, you'll be brought to a menu beforehand where you'll have a certain amount of credits to spend, which you can use to hire other MTs or ACs to come along with you and help you out with your mission. And some of the ACs that you'll see as options on here are actually ones that you had previously defeated in the arena, meaning that you'll already have this developed understanding of how they fight in combat, and it also gives the sense of familiarity with your allies. The system isn't any sort of game changer, but it's a really fun addition to the game, and there were a couple missions where bringing the right support along was super important. And since I just mentioned the arena, you know by now that I have to spend way too much of this video talking about it. And I just have to say right off the bat that Armored Core 3 definitely has my favorite arena in the series so far. There are a lot of reasons for this, but the most important in my opinion is that all of the opponents in this arena have a ton of personality to them. I've realized more and more throughout playing these games that a variety of personalities and fighting styles is the thing that I appreciate the most in the arena, and this game nails those two things more than any previous arena has. And what helps with that is that AC customization is the best that it's ever been in Armored Core 3. All the things that we've come to expect are here, as well as a whole lot more. AC3 adds a whole lot of new parts and part types, my favorite of these being ranged left arm weapons. Up to this point, you've only been able to use laser blades or arm shields on your left arm, but now you can equip it with a whole second ranged weapon and run into battle firing akimbo. My favorite thing that I tried with this was putting a grenade launcher in my left hand and a rifle in my right, chipping away at my opponents with the rifle like usual, while also bombarding them with heavy explosives. There's so much more potential with the customization in Armored Core 3, and honestly, I did not do it any justice. I barely dug into all the new stuff, but there's a lot here, and I will definitely be playing around with it more when I get to the expansion. The only downside to the customization isn't really the customization itself, but it's the missiles in the game. Now hear me out, the missiles are still really strong in Armored Core 3, and there's still a lot of different and unique types of launchers to have fun with, but the tracking can be kind of weird in this game. There were a lot of instances where I could be fighting another MT or AC, and my missiles would just whiff right past them every single time, or randomly veer into the ground, the sky, take a 90-degree turn to the right, whatever it might have been. The missiles are great when they work in this game, but a lot of the time in my experience, they kind of just went all over the place. Back to the arena though, there are these cool matchup screens that they added to the game before you actually start a match in the arena that weirdly gives me the vibe of like a kid playing with toys. And don't get me wrong, I mean that in like the best possible way, like it's really endearing to me. And when the match is over, the game asks if you want to watch a replay rather than just immediately loading into one like the previous games, which is so nice because actually way back in my Project Phantasma video, I wrote it down in my notes to complain about the fact that the replay always immediately started after a match, but I ended up cutting it from the video. So I guess I'll just bring it up now. I always hated that shit, and now it's finally gone. And something that I have to bring up is that the garage from Master of Arena is back, now called the parking garage. There are a lot more pillars in the parking garage than in Master of Arena's garage though, meaning that fights are a lot more interesting here this time around. While opponents still won't really be able to fly much, the ceilings are a little higher, so it gives them a tiny bit more room to work with. But because of all the pillars and stuff in here, the fights in here end up feeling more like an intense game of peekaboo rather than just forcing the opponent to sit still while you blast at them. Overall, I was a little upset when I saw in the menu that it was back, but once I actually tried it a couple times, I really liked it, and I didn't end up abusing it too much in this game anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. Armored Core 3 also gates your progression through the arena a little bit like how Master of Arena did. It's handled slightly differently here than it was in that game, but it's generally the same idea. If you climb through the arena too quickly, you'll no longer be able to climb the ladder, and you'll have to go and complete some missions before you're allowed to climb further. This helped the pacing in Master of Arena a lot, and it definitely has the same effect here. That being said though, I don't believe that the pacing in Armored Core 3 is among the best of the series so far. It's definitely miles ahead of Another Age, so I appreciated it in that sense. But it definitely didn't feel as well paced to me as Armored Core 2, and nowhere near as perfect as Master of Arena's pacing was. This mostly comes down to the player still being allowed to clear the entire arena by about the halfway point of the campaign, as well as the actual story in the campaign being pretty poorly paced. But let's wrap up the arena talk. I actually had a fairly easy time getting through the arena up until the A-ranked pirates. Great, they're pirates now. I actually had a fairly easy time getting through the arena up until the A-ranked pilots. All three of these guys are dangerous in their own right, but the number 1 pilot, Ace, is the one that really handed my ass to me. Ace is an incredibly mobile biped pilot, equipped with an incredible amount of firepower, capable of destroying my AC in seconds if I were to get myself in a bad spot. And Ace cheats really, really hard. Not only does he have all sorts of equipment that would put the player well overweight were they to try to replicate his build, but he also has seemingly unlimited energy. I will admit that I spent about 2 hours trying to beat Ace, and I did not see him run out of energy once in that entire time. He just flies, boosts, and overboosts around the arena constantly, and it was incredibly difficult to budget out my own energy in order to keep up with him. A big reason that I struggled with him so much was because he had a part called OP Intensify, and this is actually the replacement for Human Plus here in Armored Core 3. See, now that the story has been rebooted, Human Plus no longer exists in this new timeline. So OP Intensify takes its place as an optional part that can be equipped to your AC. It has every ability that Human Plus would give you, plus a couple new ones that didn't exist before, like improved target accuracy. And the way that the player obtains this part is very different from how they obtained Human Plus as well. Rather than it being given to the player for going 50,000 credits in debt, the player can only earn OP Intensify by completing the story campaign, meaning that this is only available to players who play Armored Core 3 past the credits rolling. There's a lot more that I could talk about with this part, but I actually barely played around with it at all, so I don't have much personal experience with it. So we'll see if I end up using it more in Armored Core 3's expansion when I get around to that one. Back to Ace though, after like an hour and a half of trying to beat him in the open arena, I finally conceded and brought him to the garage. And even here, he gave me a run for my money. His flight was handicapped, but his quick movement and devastating weapons were still enough to run my shit. But eventually, after a lot of effort, I was finally able to beat him. And these videos really make me feel like a broken record, but this was definitely the single hardest encounter I've had in the Armored Core games so far. And honestly, with how much trouble Ace managed to give me, I can only pray that he'll remain the hardest encounter for the rest of the series, but it was so satisfying to finally beat him, especially because it took so much learning and practice for me to do so. But with that, I finally got the arena talk out of my system, so let's finish up the campaign. In the later parts of the campaign, it becomes the most interesting story Armored Core has told so far. Corporations start to turn on each other, some of them disappear entirely, a terrorist organization starts to employ you, and the rogue AI that controls the world gets progressively more aggressive. But I mentioned earlier that the story pacing was a little poor, and with that, I mostly meant that all of the interesting things in this story happen in the final act, and the stuff before that, making up pretty much half of the campaign, just kind of feels like filler missions. When the story is good here, it's really damn good, but most of the game just isn't very interesting in that respect. But thankfully, the epic bosses from Another Age did end up making a return here. There were only a couple of them due to the shorter campaign length, but I'll take what I can get. They were both really interesting too, with the first one being an aquatic MT that you had to hop around sunken rooftops to battle with, and the second one pretty much just being an improved version of the massive MT fight from Another Age. There's not really a ton to be said about these two, but they were both really entertaining, and I'm really glad that this was a boss archetype that FromSoftware decided to continue running with. And while there are no crazy final bosses to note in AC3, the entire final mission was really great in this game. It has a nice balance of combat and platforming, it has a few interesting fights throughout, including one against two duplicate ACs, Both of these guys, lore-wise, being enhanced ACs that the controller made itself to protect itself, and it's even capped off by destroying the cooling unit of the controller and watching it as it overheats and falls apart. And while the controller is dying, it initiates a protocol that releases all of the locks in Layered that would allow humanity to return to the surface, hinting towards the fact that Earth may not have been uninhabitable for a long time, and the controller was keeping humanity locked down there so that it could keep its control over them. Overall, I can easily understand why so many people have said that Armored Core 3 is their favorite game in the series. And that's because I would probably have to agree that this is one of, if not my favorite game in the series so far. While it did have some issues with the story pacing in my opinion, the customization, amazing arena, and the last few missions of the campaign make up for it for me personally. So overall, I'm going to give Armored Core 3 an 8.0. But what do you guys think? Those of you that have played the game, those of you learning about it for the first time, let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to go ahead and leave a like, a comment, a subscription, just anything to let me and the algorithm know that you did enjoy. It helps me out a lot, so I really appreciate it. And I haven't mentioned this before in these videos, but if you didn't know, I stream almost every day right here on the channel, and with Armored Core 6 coming out very soon after this video, you might enjoy hanging out and seeing me experience that game for the first time live. So make sure that if you want to catch that, you're subscribed to the channel with notifications on. And hey, if you enjoyed this video and you haven't seen them already, then you'll definitely enjoy the rest of my Armored Core videos, so I'll have them linked right here on screen.